Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second of this 4-session series on reflecting on the passion and death of Jesus. And today the story picks up with Jesus has been arrested. He's gone through the agony in the garden, and now once he's arrested, he is sent to essentially to be on trial by both the religious authorities and the civil, or in this case, the Roman authorities. And so today we will talk about those two trials, if you will, and that's a very loose term. But then also in the middle of talking about that, we'll spend a little bit on Peter's denials, because this is where the part of the story that comes in. And so to begin, just a little background on the authority structure that was in place at this time in this area of the world. The Romans had occupied the land, what we would call the Middle East today. So they were the ultimate authority. But like any occupying force, they also utilized some of the existing structures of governance. And so prior to the Roman occupation, the Jewish people would have been partly under self-rule, but they had also been ruled by the Greeks and so forth. But in the Jewish community, the Israelite community, their authorities, their religious authorities, were also civil authorities. There was no separation of church and state. It was all one. If you think back to like King David, all of the authority, both religious and secular, was all under one person. So that was the Jewish tradition, although they had been occupied by different groups throughout that time. Now they're occupied by the Romans. And so the religious authorities had some civil responsibility, but mostly they dealt with the religious side of things. However, a little later in the story, when we talk about Herod, we'll show how he fits in, because he is really a Jewish ruler who is given some secular authority. We'll come back to him when we get to Pilate. But Jesus is first sent to the religious authorities. The scriptures describe that he is sent to the house of the high priest. And there he appears before what is called the Sanhedrin, which was a council of the religious leaders, made up of the priests, the chief priests. These were the people who regulated the worship at the temple. The scribes, these were the lawyers. They were very much familiar with the law, the covenant. It also says in the scriptures that there were elders, so I guess other leaders in the community. And possibly the Pharisees, who they themselves are a separate group, but some of them also commingled, if you will, as scribes and so forth. And then you also had Sadducees. You had all these groups of religious authorities, but the Sanhedrin seems to be made up of a council of many of them, led by the high priest. The high priest is named in 2 of the Gospels. Matthew names him as Caiaphas, as does John. John also mentions the high priest Annas, who is a relative of Caiaphas, who I think is his successor. But Caiaphas is the one named, and so it is before, clearly Jesus is first brought to the religious authorities. They were the ones who arrested him. They are the ones who brought him in. They are the ones who initiate the action. And so he's brought before this group. Now, what do they charge him with? What is their case, if you will? Well, first of all, it seems that they had some trouble making a case, because the accounts in the Gospels, if you had a chance to look at them, several times says they couldn't find any evidence, but they encouraged people to make false testimony. So it's clear that they had trouble coming up with this evidence, and it took some fabrication for them to actually even make these charges. Then there are two main charges that essentially Jesus is going to be accused of by the religious authorities. The first charge is going to be that he claimed that he was going to destroy the temple. And if you recall, and this coming Sunday, we will hear one of those accounts where he says that. This coming Sunday's gospel is from John, the cleansing of the temple. But in that action, Jesus does say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. They think he's talking actually about the physical temple, and they are quite astonished to say, they say, we've been building this for years, and you're going to do this in 3 days. But Jesus says, then the scriptures say, but he was referring to the temple of his body. But clearly Jesus made some comments about the temple, and the fact that he cleared the temple of the commerce was an attack on the temple. And I think to understand this, I do think we have to look at what the role of the temple was, how important it was to the Jewish people. The temple is where you went to encounter God. It is later on when synagogues, and even at this time, there are developing, because we know Jesus went to a synagogue in Capernaum. And so gradually that, the central, the one temple disperses, but still the temple holds a very sacred place. And it's where you went to encounter God. You went to offer sacrifice. Remember, it was the law that you had to consecrate your firstborn and bring him to the temple. And Jesus, we have that story. Mary and Joseph bring him, and Simeon and Anna are there. So the temple, and part of the temple worship was sacrifice. You had to sacrifice animals. Now, it was often inconvenient to bring animals from wherever you were coming from. So, a commerce developed, come to the temple. You can buy your sacrifices right here. And so, it makes sense. People coming from afar, well, we'll just get, the turtle doves when we get there, And so that sprang up. You had to pay a temple tax, but you had to do it in the right currency. And so they would change money. So you had money changers. So what was taking place was part of the sacrifice, but it seemed like it had become the purpose of the temple, this commerce. And that's when Jesus, cleanses the temple. So there was this accusation that he was going to, if not physically destroy, he was certainly attacking what was taking place in the temple. And there certainly is a misunderstanding that he is not going to destroy physically the temple. The Romans do that later, in about 70 AD. They destroy the temple. So this is the first charge, that in essence he is attacking a central institution of our faith, temple worship. And there's other indications of this. You may remember when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, there is this whole exchange about where we worship. You know, she says, you people worship at the temple in Jerusalem, we worship. You know, there was this sense of where was the proper place to worship, and Jesus essentially says there's going to come a time where none of that is important. So even if that was part of his teaching, people would say he's not giving the temple its due. And all those whose whole lives were caught up in the temple, this would have been certainly an affront to that. So that's the first charge, that he is going to somehow, if not destroy the temple, he is certainly attacking what we consider temple worship. The second charge, and this charge is what he's accused of several times in his life. It is brought to its fulfillment at this point, but he is accused of the crime of blasphemy, which is essentially claiming for himself what belongs to God. And that is an insult to God. There's only one God, and so you cannot claim any characteristics of God. That is making yourself God. Now the irony of that is that it's true. He is God. But clearly they didn't believe that. And so all of the things that he does throughout his life, that in his ministry, that seem to take on characteristic of God, like forgiving sins. You know, there are several stories in there where Jesus forgives sins, and that just drives the religious authorities mad, because they say, who but God can forgive sins? This man is blaspheming. He's not God. And it's interesting, they don't bring up those other incidents at his trial, because clearly there were times when he was doing things that were God-like. But they actually asked him, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus gives throughout his trial those cryptic answers. He doesn't say definitively, he says, you say so. And we'll see when we get to this exchange with Pilate, that's an interesting exchange. But he said, you say so, and that's when they say, you see, he admitted it. We don't need any more evidence. He is claiming himself to be God. And the other big part of that is throughout his life again, they accuse him of not following the law of Moses. And not only not following it, but it seems like he's changing the law of Moses. Now, Jesus would say, I'm not changing it, I am bringing it to its fulfillment. But again, the Mosaic law, so central to the life of the people, if this man is claiming somehow to change it or adapt it, then that's only God can do that. God gave us that law, which again, interestingly, is the first reading of this coming Sunday, the Ten Commandments. So all of that is brought into this charge of blasphemy. And in the law, the punishment for blasphemy is death. Stoning to death, interestingly, not crucifixion. And so that's another twist of this. Why does he end up being crucified by the Romans when he is guilty of blaspheming against the religious authorities, in which they would stone him to death? The other example in the New Testament of this is Stephen. He is charged with blasphemy, and by claiming that Jesus was God, and they stoned him. So it's interesting, and we'll get to that probably not in this session, but the actual sentence of death that is given and carried out, we'll talk about when we talk about the crucifixion. So these are the charges that they bring before him. And to dramatize how serious these charges are, the high priest tears his garments. You know, that was a symbol of profound grief. Other times in the Bible where people would rend their clothes, they're just overcome by grief, either the death of someone. And so this is dramatically displayed by the high priest. This is such an egregious crime that this man has committed. You know, it causes such grief that he tears his garments. And that is how deeply, if you will, they felt this passionate grief that this was brought about. Now, if we step back a bit and ask the question, you know, these charges are not true. So why really are the religious authorities wanting to get rid of Jesus? And so I think we can think about three things. One, there may have been some who legitimately believed this man was a blasphemer and he was going to destroy our way of life. There may have some who legitimately believed that, although it seems like, you know, the way the scriptures describe that they had to encourage false testimony, that they didn't all believe that. But I imagine there could be some, because, I mean, if you don't think Jesus is God and he's doing these things, it certainly looks like he's trying to be God, and that would be blasphemy. So that's probably part. I think a bigger reason, and Pilate actually picks up on this, is that the religious authorities are very jealous of Jesus, because he is beginning to get a following. People are beginning to question their authority, because in many ways their authority was corrupt. And so this man Jesus is beginning to get followers. People are listening to him. You know, when he attacks us, people are kind of cheering him. You know, us, you know, being the religious authority. So I think a big part of it, and the scriptures seem to indicate Pilate sensed this, is that they're just jealous of his authority. They were going to lose their authority if this man continued as he did. And then the third reason is what is captured by the high priest Caiaphas in the gospel accounts, when he says to the others, "Better for one man to die than all of us." Now, what is he talking about there? He is saying they are concerned that Jesus is, because of the people are being stirred up. That's precisely what the Romans didn't like. And, you know, they were able to kind of keep a lid on things, but when anything started to bubble up that was going to be a problem, you know, a revolt, an insurrection, or people beginning to protest, the Romans would quickly squash it. And as I mentioned, that happens in a dramatic way in about 70 AD, when the Romans quash a rebellion of the Jewish people and destroy the temple. So the Jewish religious authority leaders are saying, you know, if we can get the Romans to take this guy out, that will quell this, you know, insurrection, these people trying to support him, and the Romans will back off. You know, the irony of it is that they're essentially offering Jesus to the Romans as a sacrifice, which theologically we would say, well, he is. He is offering himself as a sacrifice for our sins. And so there's an irony that the religious, for the wrong reasons, but they're saying if this one man dies, we'll all be saved. because the Romans will back off. And that's precisely what we believe theologically, but in a very different way. That this one man dies, we're all saved from sin. So I think it's a combination of all of those things as to why the Jewish authorities want to get rid of Jesus. But they do not have the ultimate authority, or they don't believe they do, or also because they want to make sure the Romans see that he is out of the picture. They send him to Pilate. Because a question could be asked, why did Pilate even ask him? Why don't you just kill him yourself? If he violated your religious law, just take him out and kill him. Why are you asking me to do this? And I think they're doing it for a couple of reasons. One, maybe it takes away some of their responsibility, and so they can tell Jesus' followers, well, look, the Romans did it. We like this man. The Romans did it. But also, I think, to show the Romans, look, you can take care of this problem. You can leave us alone. And so they send him to Pilate. Before they do, there is an interesting scene that again gets repeated later, and that is Jesus is mocked. He's mocked by the religious authorities. Later, he gets mocked by the Roman soldiers. But if you look at the scriptures carefully, it's interesting. The mocking is different. The religious authorities tell Jesus, play the prophet, prophesy, play the prophet. And so and that makes sense because they are essentially accusing him of being a false prophet. When the Roman soldiers mock him, they put the crown of thorns on, they dress him, they say, play the king. And I think when we get to Pilate, it is that concern that bothers the Romans more, that somehow people are making this guy a king. If he's a false prophet, I don't think the Romans even bother with it, because it's not a threat to them. But a king, that becomes a threat to them. And as we see when his exchange with Pilate, it's about that. So he's mocked by the Jewish authorities for, being a false prophet. So they say, prophesy. We get to yell that out on Palm Sunday and Good Friday. And because that's what they found the most disturbing. But the Romans are going to find it a little different. So let me stop there. Any comments or questions about this exchange with the religious authorities? Yes?
Didn't you say, I thought I heard that movie where some of them said that we have a law and we can't kill somebody.
Yeah, that's what they tell Pilate, and we'll get to that because Pilate says, why don't y'all just kill him yourself? He's violated your law. And they say, but we have a law where we can't kill, but we're not quite sure what they're quoting there because they do have a law where they can kill. The Old Testament is very clear. There are crimes in which they can stone people to death. Adultery was one of them, remember? That's the scene in Jesus' time. They were well within the law, to stone the woman in adultery. That's why Jesus, just essentially says, okay, you can do it, but if you're without sin, be the first one. So that's an interesting, but it seems like it's just a way of them saying, we want you to take care of it. I think I saw another hand. Teresa?
What did the Romans believe again? What was their religious belief?
Well, the Romans, it was more like a mythological, the Roman gods, almost, certainly at times, like the emperor was God.
Okay.
So, but the Romans were pretty relatively tolerant of the religious beliefs of like the Jews, as long as they didn't get out of hand.
Okay.
And that's probably, somebody mentioned that somewhere along the line, that was one of the geniuses of the Roman Empire, is that they didn't try to, when they occupied somebody, just obliterate the culture, because that would be impossible. So they let the Jews do what they did. They just kept a little hand on it, like if it gets too much out of hand, we're going to step in. But they allowed the people some sense of freedom. That's probably why they were so successful in creating their empire. So it is at this point we could pause to take a look at something that's happening behind the scenes while Jesus' trial is going on, and that is the denial of Peter. All four Gospels give an account of Peter's denial, which, there are not a lot of things, a lot of details that are in all four Gospels, but all four do have Peter denying. They do differ in like who is the one accusing Peter after the first one. They all say a servant woman, and then the others. And in a couple of the Gospels, they separate, like there's a denial, and there's another part of the story that a denial. In a couple of them, they just do all three denials together. But there's multiple, all of them have Peter denying Jesus multiple times. And so, one of the things that is looked at by Scripture scholars is this something that really happened? Did Peter really deny Jesus? There is evidence that he did, first of all, that all four would account for it. And then there is this thing that I mentioned last time, that usually if something in Scripture is not very flattering to the heroes, it's probably more likely that it happened. Because why would the followers of Peter, who, essentially we're getting to that point in history when the Gospels are written, we're talking about, they're followers of Jesus, but they're all people who learned from the apostles. Why would they tell the story that really makes Peter look very bad if it weren't true? So there is sense that it was, it's kind of like, today, we're very hesitant to say anything negative about even, a former pope, but we find out some things that they did, but that they kind of like, they can't have anything bad about them. And here, they're saying about their first leader, that he was, his betrayal was pretty dramatic. So Peter's denial, which is predicted by Jesus, and then is redeemed by Jesus in John's Gospel after the resurrection. There is the scene of Jesus and Peter at the shore. And 3 times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" Which is a clear balancing to the 3 times that Peter denied him. So the big picture is that this is an important story, seemingly factual, that the evangelism. And why is it an important story? Because if you look at Peter and how that is really the story of redemption, and it's really the Christian story. It's the story of Christ, that he takes us who are sinners and we are redeemed by his life. And we can discuss when was Peter actually redeemed, and some scholars say it is when Jesus looked at him and he started to weep bitterly. That is when he was forgiven. It's played out later in this exchange of John, but it is so to think that to look on the face of Jesus leads to our forgiveness and redemption. That is the heart of what we believe in our Christian faith. We are redeemed by the person of Jesus, just as Peter was when he saw that face. And just to think about what that exchange of looks must have been like. In Jesus' eyes must have been disappointment. It must have been sadness, but there also must have been love for Peter. And so Peter weeps bitterly, but he doesn't leave. He still hangs around. He's in the upper room with it. So I believe that the redemption of Peter begins at the moment he sees Jesus' face. He hears the cock crow. Because otherwise, if he would not have sensed that forgiveness or redemption, he probably could have taken the route of Judas, which was to kill himself. That's the difference between Judas and Peter. They both betray Jesus. But Peter accepts forgiveness and is open to redemption. Judas is not. So we see the difference of what happens to them. So you can see why the evangelists would want to include this story. Certainly it has all the elements of being true, but because it really, if you told one story about our Christian faith, about what it means to be redeemed, here's someone who has, if you want to think, sinned by denying who Jesus is, and then he encounters Jesus' face, Jesus' love, and that redeems him. That's our story. That's our story in our Christian. We are sinners, but we are redeemed by the encounter with Jesus. So certainly then that story is going to be a big part of that of the early church, because it really dramatizes what they're preaching. That's what the disciples were out there preaching. Okay, any comments or questions about that before we move to the second trial, and that is with Pilate? Okay. So, the religious authorities send him to Pilate. And as I said, if we think about why didn't they just deal with Jesus themselves? And Pilate even says that. I think, part of that is the whole political dynamic. They want to get the Romans on their good side, so they're going to give to the Romans this man who, the Romans knew of him. They were astute enough to be watching the people who might cause problems. And so they knew of him. And so, perhaps the religious authorities think, this is a way for us to get in good graces with the Romans by giving them this insurrectionist. Because they claim they tell Pilate, he made himself to be king, and so he's no friend of Caesar. And that is when Pilate seemingly begins to have some second thoughts. Because initially, Pilate is ready to just say, he's done nothing, you just take him back. But it's in John's Gospel, and I'd just like to read it just because I think it is a turning point. It's in John's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 7 to 9. This is John, and John has the longest exchange between Jesus and Pilate. He actually has one conversation, and then Pilate goes out and talks to the people, and then comes back and talks to Jesus. So he's got this long exchange. And so this is the point raised earlier. The Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Now when Pilate heard this statement, he became even more afraid. So he was already beginning to get a little, and then he goes back to Jesus and say, "Where are you from?" So when he hears about this, the Son of God, and then there is going to be this exchange about him being king, that seems to Pilate to be more of a concern than if he was blaspheming or if he was going to tear down the temple. Pilate didn't care about any of that. But this is why the religious authorities are kind of throwing that in. Well, he's a revolutionary against the Romans. He's trying to make himself another Caesar. And so Pilate is, beginning to perhaps have second thoughts. But ultimately, he still isn't ready to necessarily agree to what the religious leaders want. So at times, it seems like Pilate's trying to help Jesus. He even tells Jesus, "Don't you know, I can almost essentially, I can make this go away. Just play along with me." And Jesus doesn't answer. But I think ultimately, Pilate is a politician. We have a lot of extra biblical evidence about Pilate. He's listed in different Roman chronologies and so forth. He was the procurator of Judea and Samaria at this time, for a number of years. So Pilate is clearly a historical figure that is evident in other histories besides the Bible. And that's why we believe today that he gets mentioned in the creed, which is so, if you think about it, our creed, what we believe, the only other people besides Jesus, Mary, and the Trinity that are mentioned in the creed is Pontius Pilate. It's the only proper name. I mean, it's really kind of amazing, but when that creed, which is from the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, you can see perhaps one of the things they're trying to counteract is people saying, this man Jesus never really existed. He was not human, And so by grounding his life in the life of someone who can be proven existed, it was a way for us to express that belief that this is a historical fact. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ is a historical fact. How do we know that? Because he suffered under Pontius Pilate, and we have a record of that. So Pilate is famous and infamous in that regard. But ultimately, he's a politician. I mean, and that's what he's there, and he's got a lot of things that he's keeping his hands on. Yes.
Why do you think Jesus was so cryptic at that time and not really, answering the questions directly?
I read one description of that is that in a similar way, why Jesus tells parables, which used to frustrate the Bible. Just tell us plainly. You're telling us these stories. Tell us clearly. And they say that. They express that in the God. So that, it's almost as if Jesus is forcing them to make up their own mind. They have to come to that. I'm not gonna, these are my words, I'm not gonna make it easy for them. And so, he is a bit cryptic, And when Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? Which, interestingly, that very question is asked in all 4 Gospels. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus' answer is the same. You say so. That is cryptic because that can be taken so many ways. It could be that, well, I'm not, but you say I am. Or it could be you say so, yes, that is true, so, but it's cryptic. And I think, and that's, although it seems that those listening to him thought that he agreed that he was. Because then Pilate goes and actually lists him, the King of the Jews. That's what's the title above the cross. And the Jewish authorities, tell Pilate that's not true. He claimed to be king. Pilate said, well, what I've done, it's there. So it's not real clear why he's cryptic, but it is evident that those who he was talking to thought he was affirmative. When he says something similar to that to the high priest, that's when he tears his robe. See, he admitted it. So it's not a denial, but it's not an affirmation either. So Pilate is dealing with these, with the religious authorities. It seems that he doesn't want to kill Jesus. He tells the authorities several times, I find no guilt in this man, take him yourself. And that's when they said, no, he's no friend of Caesar, and so forth. And, one scripture commentary said that when they talked, this was a time that potentially Pilate had lost his backer with the emperor. There was an underling to the Emperor Tiberius at this time, who was a big backer of Pontius Pilate. He fell out of favor with the emperor. So was Pilate beginning to think, I've lost favor in Rome, and here these people saying they're going to tell Caesar about this? Was that a way of kind of getting Pilate, a little bit more nervous? Because, look, I don't have any backers in Rome anymore. And so if this looks bad in Rome because this man is making himself out to be Caesar, did that further push him? So he's got all of this going on with him. And then we have two interesting accounts that are only in Matthew that affect Pilate. We have Pilate's wife. In Matthew, we have the only reference to Pilate's wife. And she comes in chapter 27. It says, while Pilate was still seated on the bench, kind of ruling, his wife sent him a message. Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I suffered much in a dream today because of him. So, that raises all kinds of things. Why is she mentioned? Why only Matthew? One thought is that, Matthew is the gospel of the dreamers. He has Joseph dreaming in the very beginning. All these, Joseph dreams. It's in a dream that he's told to take Mary as his wife. It's in a dream that the Magi don't go to Herod on the way back after going to see Jesus. So Matthew, utilizes dreams. Matthew also, Matthew in Matthew's infancy stories, he tells the story of the Magi, the three kings. They are three Gentiles. And the point of Matthew's story is that the Gentiles recognize who is the newborn king better than the Jewish authorities. And so here, the Gentile woman recognizes who the righteous man is, even more so than the so-called religious leaders. And Pilate's wife, actually, in the Eastern Church, becomes a saint. We know her name. It's a good Italian name, Claudia Villia Procula. So she must have come with Pilate from Italy. What was not Italy, but that area. And in the early church, she's considered a saint. And there's some speculation, that she converted because of this. And even there's some, I don't have any basis for it, that Pilate converted, but we don't really have any evidence of that. But interesting that here she is. We know her name because, again, we have historical records of Pilate and his family. And so she comes in there. And then, in the same set of verses, Pilate says the famous line, I'm going to, this man's blood is on your hands. I'm washing my hands of it. And the whole idea of innocent blood is something that the gospel writers do, because that Jesus is the innocent lamb. He is not guilty. And so Pilate even says, I'm innocent of the blood, and the people yell, well, let it be on us. So Matthew throws in those two little side things that basically suggest that Pilate's wife believed who Jesus was, and that Pilate, says, I'm not doing this. I'm washing my hands of this. So then Pilate does something interesting, but only in Luke. We don't know why. He decides to send Jesus to Herod. Now, who is Herod? Well, we know of other Herods, and they're all related. There is Herod the Great, who is ruling at the time of Jesus' birth. He's the one who wants to have the children, because he's the one the Magi wrote to. This Herod is believed to be his son, Herod Antipas. Now, the Herods, or the Herodians as they were referred to, they were Jewish leaders, the closest thing that they had to king. They didn't always use that word king, but they were pretty close to that. But when the Romans took over, again, this is part of their, they didn't get rid of the Jewish rulers. They just kind of made them in charge of different areas. So Herod was in charge of Galilee. Pilate was in charge of Judea and Samaria. So they were somewhat equals in that regard, but Herod was a leftover from the Jewish authority structure that the Romans left in place. Again, it's kind of a way, well, we'll utilize them, kind of that way we don't antagonize them too much as we try to rule them. But Pilate was over to it. So why does he send him to Herod? Because the statement is made that this man did all of these things throughout Galilee. This is what the chief priests tell Pilate. All these things we're accusing him, he did it. You just ask anybody, it was throughout Galilee. So Pilate says, Herod is in charge of Galilee. This could be my out. And Herod happens to be in Jerusalem, which wouldn't have been unusual. There's a big feast going on. So he says, I'm going to send him to Herod. And Herod is this is only in Luke's gospel, and Luke does mention throughout the gospels many more times Herod. So Herod and his family are characters more prevalent in Luke for whatever reason. So he sends him because he says, on hearing this, Pilate asked him if he was a Galilean, and upon learning that he was, so I guess Jesus either answered him or somebody did, he's under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him. And it says, Herod was glad to see Jesus. Now remember, this is the same Herod who was intrigued by John the Baptist and made a fool of himself and ended up having to kill John the Baptist because he made a fool of himself by promising, half his kingdom. But John the Baptist was very critical of him because this Herod had married his brother's wife, and she didn't like him, the wife, of course. So she's the one who got the daughter, Salome, to go and say, give me John the Baptist's head. And if you remember the story, Herod he's disappointed. He doesn't want to do that, but he made a fool by making the promise, and he had to do it. So Herod, he liked listening to John the Baptist, and it says, Herod was very glad to see Jesus. He had been wanting to see him for a long time, for he had heard about him and had been hoping to see him perform some sign. So Herod is intrigued by this. But he questions Jesus at length, but Jesus gives you no answer. So interestingly, though, does Herod, say, let's agree with the Jewish authorities, let's kill him? He sends him back to Pilate. And then there's that interesting line, Pilate and Herod, who were enemies, became good friends after that day. So, looking a little bit behind that, they were probably political rivals, because Herod was in charge of one part of the territory, Pilate the other. Pilate was, more from the Roman line, if you will, of authority. Herod had this Jewish background, and he was part of the Jewish authority. There is a story outside the Bible that there was a dramatic protest against Pilate at one point in his career, led by the Herodians, the family of Herod. So there seems to be great conflict there between the two. This also goes back to one account that I read, that this benefactor of the emperor who Pilate was in good with, once he was out of the picture, the emperor liked Herod more than, and we see that because Herod founded the city of Tiberias in the Middle East after the emperor Tiberius. So Herod and the emperor had good relations. Pilate and the emperor did not. So all of this is going on. So why now friends? Well, I think Herod sees Pilate as sending Jesus to him as respecting his authority. This man is in your jurisdiction. So, that was a gesture on Pilate's part, although I think Pilate was just trying to get rid of him. Of Herod saying, okay, well that's, nice of you, Pontius, to respect my authority, but then Herod finds him innocent as well. And so perhaps the fact that they both came to that agreement kind of solidified their friendship. But it is, it's an interesting line as to why, but I think it's because they saw this the same way, but also, Pilate demonstrated that respect for Herod, because Pilate probably could have just said, well, this is here, I'm going to make the decision. And so the scriptures say both of them find Jesus innocent. And remember, if Herod really wanted to get rid of Jesus, he ultimately had no problem getting rid of John the Baptist. He didn't really want to. So, Herod could have. But they both find him innocent. And so that raises the question then, why do they sentence him to death? They both find him innocent. Why do they sentence him to death? And that would be a question for next time. Any questions? Yes?
Was Herod's authority at all religious, or was it just
It seems like some, but this is the complication of what is the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, what is their relationship to Herod? The governance structure of, let's just use the word church and state at this time is very complicated. Herod must have had some religious authority, because in the story of the Magi, remember, they go to see Herod, and Herod calls in all of the religious authorities and asks them. So it almost seems to be that Herod has a little more authority than they do. Now, this is 30 years later. Have the Romans kind of shifted that around a lot? It seems that probably so, because the high priest, they didn't bring him to Herod first. They brought him to Pontius Pilate. Again, I think that's a political calculation. Let's bring him to the Romans and get them involved. Herod would not have brought that dimension in the same way. So I think it's complicated. It's hard to, but Herod was a Jew. And he's from that line of, the kings, but this point, where does that authority go? It seems like chief priests, the elders, they've got a bit more authority. Herod, that authority structure is kind of dying out, and then we do see it. The line of Herod's ends, not that much longer, and the rabbis and so forth, they continue. So I think there's a shifting of that, but it is a little murky. Any other questions? Yes.
I thought, when you talk about the temple, that Jesus is the temple, and he'll be raised back up in 3 days.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he is referring to when he says, destroy this temple, and they think he's saying the building, and it'll be raised in 3 days. He's talking about himself, and that is ultimately the shift in focus. If we think in the Old Testament, the people to encounter God, they went to the temple. Jesus, in essence, is saying, to encounter God, come to me. And that is the shift. Now we encounter God in the person of Jesus Christ, not in a physical place per se. The temple was not like we would think of a church. The temple itself was a, kind of the presence of God. In a different way than we would say about a church. We would say God is present in the church in different ways, but mostly in the sacrament. So that is, in essence, Jesus making that shift to say, you encountered God in this abstract way. Now you encountered Him personally in me.
Is that like the tabernacle, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the tabernacle comes from the temple. That was the place, the Holy of Holies. That is where they identified kind of the essence of God in the temple. So we've adopted that with the tabernacle. Any other questions or comments? And so next time we will start with this sentence of death that he's given, and then in essence we'll kind of make the way of the cross, because that is the crucifixion story, and talk about that, what the scriptures tell us about that. And then the last session, we'll spend the whole session is focusing on the death of Jesus, certainly the particulars of that in the scriptures, but also what does that mean for us, because that is the heart of this Lenten season. So thank you.
Thank you.